Welcome to The Authority File, the podcast that features conversations about the life cycle of scholarly communication. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. In this 4-episode series, I'm joined by Paul D.B. Watkins, professor of English at Vancouver Island University. Paul is the author of Soundin, Canaan, Black Canadian Poetry, Music, and Citizenship, a uniquely researched and presented monograph that, while distinguishing aesthetics from rhetoric, traces a line from Black Canadian poetry through music to describe Black Canadian life, experience, and citizenship. A DJ himself, Paul mirrors the remixing and sampling methods used by musicians to enhance his research with samples of poetry, literature, interviews, and cultural elements, and even an accompanying playlist, to more deeply portray Black life in Canada. The title is published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press, which generously supports this series. Before we get started, if you want to keep up on the latest programming from the Authority File, you can subscribe to our monthly newsletter for information on the current and previous month's episodes. To subscribe, simply visit choice360.org, click on the newsletter sign-up banner in the top right corner, and select the Choice Podcast Updates option. While you're there, you can also sign up for other newsletters published by Choice. In this second episode of our series, we talk about how Paul's DJ work directly influenced the writing of the book, how he decentered himself during his research, and how that relates to white scholars writing about Black literature, art, and culture. So I'd like to get talk a little bit about sort of, the mechanics of putting the book together. And I did want to ask you if you could talk a little bit about your work as a DJ and how that influenced the writing of your book. Besides having an encyclopedic knowledge of music, what other aspects of the DJ methodology did you bring to your research and writing?
Yeah, so one of the major through lines in the book is music. So every poet I look at interrogates and integrates, right, in different ways, musicality, music into their work, not just thematically, but structurally and rhythmically, right. In the sense, right, they're not only writing poems, they're composing soundscapes, right? I've said this, but music is both method and metaphor. That interplay between music and poetry and justice is central to how they imagine freedom, community, and belonging. So that's, pretty central early on. Austin Clarke, he's often considered the first Black Canadian novelist to have a novel published by a mainstream press. And he once lamented that reviewers often overlook the role of music in his writing. Right. And his point was, if they missed that, what else were they missing? So that really struck with me. So music isn't the only lens I use, but it's a key one, especially the sort of idea of improvisation. It's an entryway into the project, and it's how I sort of shaped the book early on, structured through what I call a DJ methodology. Right. So by that, just as a DJ layers, samples, remixes tracks, I try to weave together different kinds of material. So close readings of text, outside soundings, my own insights, and most importantly, the poet's own voices, right? That's why I've built interviews into the project from the very beginning, was to ensure that my role wasn't, about directing from above, but about mixing, about bringing elements into relation so that the readers can hear, feel, and think alongside them. When you're in grad school, you're often asked, like, what's your methodology, right? And I was asked that question, right? Are you working with a feminist lens? Is it a Marxist lens? Is it something else? Right. And for me, that just it didn't quite work. So the DJ methodology was my way of creating a space where I could bring different kinds of theoretical frameworks into the mix. So literary and cultural history, social issues, interviews with poets. And it was also a way to decenter my own authority. Right? I didn't want to be the absolute voice in my book. I wanted to be negotiated between my interpretations, the texts themselves, the context they're in, and what the poets have to say about their own work. And, some people, one of the questions I was sort of asked by the thesis committee is does this create some kind of abstraction, having so much sampling, right? Does it sort of lessen the impact of the argument? I actually think it does the opposite, right? I think it brings things into focus by recontextualizing them. So Wade Compton has this really useful term in his book After Canaan. It's a neologism. That's where you fuse words together. And, academics, we really like these, new fancy words. Anyways,
Right.
the neologism he comes up with is schizophonophilia. It literally means the love of multiple sounds. For me, both as an academic and a DJ, that phrase captures something essential, right? The joy of layering, of audio interplay, of letting fragments speak to one another. And that's the kind of practice I try to model in the book. And I hope the reader experiences that in spirit, not as me laying down the definitive track, but as me opening a set where different voices, traditions, and sounds resonate together, are mixed, and ultimately perhaps even then remixed.
Yeah, that's excellent. I feel like sampling, just if we're talking about that aspect of music making, is almost a political act in itself. And sort of bringing that into the sort of structure of your uh, book is a really cool reflection of that as well.
Hmm.
You mentioned, sort of the process of decentering yourself just now. And I'm curious, while writing your book and interviewing the poets and using these multiple research methods, um, and also refuting what Leslie Sanders describes as, quote, the absolute truth. How did that method conflict really with the more traditional approaches to
Mm.
academic writing? I mean, you mentioned sort of defending your thesis. How does it relate to white scholars writing about Black literature,
Mm.
art, and culture, and so on?
Yeah. Well, firstly, the whole world benefits from Black art and
Hmm.
creativity, right? Full stop. As a lifelong music lover and now as an educator, I've been benefited immensely from studying and being in dialogue with Black poets and musicians. So I try to see myself in some ways as a conduit, a kind of DJ. So the
Hmm.
art historian Robert Ferris Thompson, he once described himself as a medium under possession. I think he even used the word like as metaphor. So while also pointing to what he called indestructible lines of happening that exist beyond the critic's reach. And I find that description resonates, right? My own role is not to claim ownership, right? But to amplify, connect, and create space for those lines of happening to be heard. So the reality, though, is that academia remains in a lot of ways a very white space. That was
Hmm.
certainly true of my undergrad experience at UBC, where I encountered very few, if any, Black Canadian texts and histories. I think, I picked up a book by Dion Brand and George Eliot Clark from a bookstore, just sort of, looking through the poetry section. And that was like my introduction, but it was, something I did on my own.
Right.
So this absence, I think it fuels a sense of responsibility in my own teaching. Right. I want students to have access to the kinds of art that I know can be truly transformational. At the same time, I'm conscious of not wanting to speak over or become dominant, right? To become the dominant voice in relation to Black artists. And honestly, I consider myself a student. I think that's an important sort of distinction, right? That the learning doesn't end, right? Rather, it keeps evolving like any good mix does. There's always things to echo, right? To add to it, right? And to sort of build on what Leslie Sanders is saying, right? There's a danger, I think, for any scholar to label their work or thinking as an absolute truth,
Right. Hmm.
because at that point you're closing meaning, right? Or at least you're attempting to. And I think some of that comes from a fear, right, of not wanting to be wrong. But also, scholars, we spend a lot of time studying and building years of knowledge, right? And I'm not saying we shouldn't trust experts, right? That's not what I'm saying at all.
Right.
But that we need to keep the creative spirit alive, right? Because it's that creative spirit that keeps us questioning individuals.
Yeah, and I feel like this, what you're writing about in particular is sort of uniquely open to interpretation, in certain ways, especially the aesthetic part of it.
Mm,
There's all kinds of ways to listen to and interpret, words and music and art as, when they all come together.
mm,
Um, and speaking of that, I did want to go back to the aesthetic and rhetorical qualities of the art that the writers and musicians in your book create. Um, I think it would be great if you could just provide us with a couple examples. I mean, you mentioned, them up front, and
mm.
um, just talk about some of those from the book and discuss how they support these dual qualities.
For sure. And maybe let me just start by taking it from a different angle, just to sort of get the conversation, towards the direction of as I think the poets in the book are operating. So I'm reminded of an old debate, and I bring this up in the book in a coda section
Mm-hmm.
between Harlem poet Claude McKay and W.E.B. Du Bois about art and propaganda, right? So McKay felt propaganda would weigh down art and block what he saw as a genuine Black literary tradition, while Du Bois, on the other hand, he famously said that he didn't give a damn for art that wasn't propaganda. So for him, propaganda wasn't a dirty word. I know it's loaded with all sorts of connotations, right? But rather it was the soil art grew from, right? The rhetoric that could push society towards change. Amiri Baraka picked up the same idea. He believed that poetry had to have utility, that you could make a song about feeding people and still have it be beautiful. So for white poets, especially conceptual ones, so if, in terms of conceptual poetry, the focus can just be on the aesthetics, right? At least in theory. Of course, I think all art is political, but, think about Kenneth Goldsmith's controversial performance where he read Mike Brown's autopsy report as a poem, right? So without any self-reflection, right? And so the piece basically ended up dissecting Brown's body under the name of conceptualism. And for the poets in the work, even though they're doing really innovative things with aesthetic, that doesn't quite work, right? And as Compton told me in an interview, conceptual poetry tends to be about white countercultural concerns. It's punk rock. It's about killing your parents in a metaphorical sense. But as he told me, right, that doesn't work. We don't want to kill our parents because our parents barely survived, right? And they carry the tools of our liberation. So let's take Compton's work, for instance, right? In his collection Performance Bond, he uses the DJ approach. So mixing, sampling, recontextualizing. And he does that to bring Vancouver's historical Black community, Hogan's Alley, into the present. So the neighborhood was torn down in the 1960s to build a freeway. And Compton remixes the historical record. He even included a CD with his book back in 2004. I'm not sure if if it was to include music again, what format it would take. And I saw him perform parts of it live in 2010 with 3 turntables, a sampler, and a DJ partner. And it was incredible, right? There's history, poetry, hip hop beats colliding in real time. So here are the aesthetics and the politics, right? They were sort of inseparable, that it was, part of the process. And, another example I write about in the book is Eminer Bessie Phillips' long poem, Zong. So it works, Philip has background as a lawyer, right? And also as a poet, so was a working lawyer. So working with, it's just a few pages of text from the legal case. But I don't know if people are familiar with the Zong Massacre, but the Zong Massacre, it was a major touchstone in the abolitionist movement, but it was where 150 Africans were thrown overboard so that the crew could claim insurance on lost cargo. So in Zong, she fractures and rearranges the text into what I term an improvised dub chant. So the words, but just as importantly, the silences between them create space for life, mourning, and survival, where the law only records loss. She even leans right into the slippage between Zong and song, reminding us that sound and collective listening are central to the work. And in 2013, same thing, I got to experience it. I was actually part of a full-length reading of the poem with live musicians, so it was transformative. That performance turned right into a brutal archive. It turned a brutal archive into a communal act of sounding, right, and remembrance. So this is sort of like one way art, I think, can breathe life into the sciences of history. They seem conceptual in framework, but obviously the aesthetics and the rhetorical function, they're able to do both, right? And they're both powerful and very beautiful works in their own way. And I think the performance of that, right, highlights that power.
You just heard from Paul D.B. Watkins. Paul is a professor of English at Vancouver Island University and the author of Soundin, Canaan, Black Canadian Poetry, Music, and Citizenship, available now through Wilfrid Laurier University Press, which generously supports this series. Join us next week when we look at how Paul's book addresses the meanings of citizenship, including the idea of sonic citizenship, and how it relates to the many ways music can be sampled and mixed. Remember, if you want to keep up on the latest programming from the Authority File, you can subscribe to our monthly newsletter for information on the current and previous month's episodes. To subscribe, simply visit choice360.org, click on the newsletter sign-up banner in the top right corner, and select the Choice Podcast Updates option. While you're there, you can also sign up for other newsletters published by Choice. The Authority File podcast is brought to you every week by a small but extraordinary team, including Choice's advertising manager Pam Marino, digital media producer Sabrina Kofer, and digital media assistant Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.